In this series of exercises, we're going to be using JavaScript to build out an analog clock. This is going to require that we use a lot of the various things that we've been learning up until this point to build this clock. But here we'll have the opportunity to apply some of the lessons that we've learned so that we can actually build a functional element. To start off with, I just have a basic HTML file. I'm linking out to a blank CSS file. We'll be adding some CSS eventually, but we will begin by creating the HTML that we're going to need for this particular project. Here's how the project is going to break down. To start off, we're going to have an HTML document that contains an SVG image of a clock with hour, minute, and second arms. Over the next few exercises, we'll be using objects and methods to get the current time. We'll be using variables to store information. We're going to use methods to break the time into hours, minutes, and seconds. We'll be using operators to translate the information into degrees on a circle, and we'll be using DOM element properties to position the arms correctly. The end result will be a simple but accurate analog clock that you can place on any web page. Our main task in this particular project is to get the hour, minute, and second arms to move around the circle and actually show the current time. We're going to do this using the transform property in CSS. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll begin by creating the HTML I'm going to need. I'll start off with a main element, and inside of that I'm going to make a div, and I'll give it a class of clockbox. Inside of this div, I'm going to place some SVG code. Now, just to make things a little bit quicker, I'm going to be using this SVG code right here, and I've gone ahead and provided this to you in notes within the class. This is inline SVG code, and that is code that is directly embedded within our HTML document. In order to do this, we use the SVG element, and this means that the SVG code is part of the HTML document itself, rather than being loaded from a separate file. When you use inline SVG code, it's easy to add it to an HTML document. It does not require any additional files to be loaded. It's flexible because the code is actually part of the HTML document, and you can manipulate and style it using CSS and JavaScript, just like any other HTML element. And in regards to performance, it reduces the number of HTTP requests, and since we're generating the element with just code, it in many instances can take up less space than actually linking out to the image. However, if you do have a complex SVG, then it's better to use an external SVG file and load it into the HTML document using your image or object element. Inside of the SVG element, we have a G element right here, and that's the container used to group SVG elements. When we apply transformations to the G element, they're going to be performed to all of the child elements, and any of its attributes are going to be inherited by the child elements. So once we group something with the G element, we can transform the whole group of shapes as if it was a single shape. In this particular example, I actually have several G elements. So I have the SVG for the clock, and then I have the clock face, which is going to just be the circular part. I have an element for the hour hand, I have an element for the minute hand, and I have an element for the second hand. If we save our page and refresh this in the browser, you're going to see that it currently looks like this. So it just looks like a big black circle. We're going to need to use a little bit of CSS so that we can style this and that it looks a little bit more like a clock. So let's go ahead and let's do that right now. I'm going to go into my CSS file, which currently is blank. I'll just build out some basic styles on main. We're going to use a display of flex. We'll use justify content, and we'll set that to center. And I'm going to align items to the middle. This is just ensuring that everything is going to be centered inside of the main container. I'm going to add a little bit of padding. We'll use 2 M's, and I'm going to set my height to 90 VH, which is the vertical height of the page. So if we go ahead and refresh, you'll see how this is now centered in the middle of the screen, which is what we want. Now let's go ahead and style our clock and our clock box. I'm going to start off by making a rule for hash clock. And if you reference the HTML, you'll see that the SVG has an ID of clock. And then I also have this class of clock box. So we're going to actually use a group selector right now and target both of those elements. And we're going to just set the width of these elements to be 100%. Then I'm going to move on to apply some styles to the clock itself. We'll start off with styling our circle element. So this is the first part of our clock. It's going to need a little stroke, and obviously we don't want to fill and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and target that. And we're going to go ahead and set our fill to none. When you want to control an SVG image that's coded into your web page, you're going to select the SVG element like we're doing here, and then you can go ahead and use the fill property, which is going to allow you to set the color of the SVG's fill. So what we want to do here is we want to set the fill to none. We don't want it to have a fill, but we are going to specify a stroke, and I'm just going to go ahead and I'll make my stroke blue. Then I'm going to go ahead and specify my stroke width, and we're just going to go ahead and set this to 9. And then finally, I'm going to add a property for stroke miter limit, and we'll set this to 10. The stroke miter limit controls how the lines attach using SVGs. If we save now and we refresh, you're going to see a blue stroke, and it's probably a little bit hard to see, but there's a blue stroke now that exists around the circle. So now let's go ahead and move on. The next element that we want to affect is going to be the mid circle, which is the middle portion of my circle, if you will. So I'm going to go back into my CSS and we'll make a class to select mid circle. This is kind of like the dot, if you will, in the center of our clock. And all I'm going to do here is just set my fill, and we'll go ahead and use that same shade of blue, 069. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make a rule for my hour marks. So just really quickly, I have a path with a class of hour marks, and this is actually what's rendering the black portion of my circle. In this SVG file, we have determinations which are going to set points around our circle so that we can use those so that it behaves like a clock. Let's go ahead and style the hour marks. These are the ticks around the clock face. Again, I'm going to set my fill to none. I'm going to set my stroke, and we'll use our 069. And let's just we're going to use the same settings that we have here. So I'll just copy these to make this go a little bit quicker. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to the hour arm. So here's the hour arm. That's going to allow us to control the arm that is going to represent the hour. And just so you see, I have a minute arm and I also have a second arm. So let's go back to our CSS right here, and we'll go ahead and make some CSS for this. I'm going to copy the rules that we just did, and we're just going to change the stroke width. We want this to be a little bit thicker. So let's put that at 18, and I'll leave the stroke miter limit at 10. And then I'm going to move on to my minute arm. And again, we're going to use the same sort of settings, but we want to change the stroke width here. So we're going to reduce the stroke width down. Let's make that 10. We don't want it to be quite as thick as our hour arm. And then I'm going to make a rule for the second arm. And again, we're going to use the same code, but I'm going to change the stroke width to 5. Now, if we save and we refresh, you're going to not see some of those things that are happening. And that's because right now, the circle is filled with a black color. So if we come into our code right here, each of our arms have a circle class with sizing dash box, and we're going to use this as a selector, and we're going to go ahead and tell the fill to be none for those elements. I'm just going to go ahead and make a new rule for sizing box, and we're just going to go ahead and set our fill to none. If we refresh now, it looks more like a clock. We've gone ahead and gotten rid of that fill. And the reason why the sizing box is important, the reason why we need that on each of our various arms of our clock, is that it is used to center the arms so they're all going to rotate correctly around the same axes. If we didn't have this, because these are different sizes, we would have problems with them rotating around the same axis point. And then the final CSS that we're going to add right now is we're going to target the hour, minute, and second elements, and we are going to move their transform origin. So we want to make sure that all of the arms rotate around the same center point. And once again, because they are not the same distance, they're not the same height, it's hard to kind of see right now because they're sitting on top of each other, but you can see that these are not the same height. By going ahead and changing the transform origin, we can ensure that they're all going to be centered and they're all going to transform around the center of our graphic. So I'm going to go ahead and use my transform origin to do this. And then we're going to go ahead and just add a transition property. And this will come into play once we actually start to animate our clock. I'm going to go ahead and set this to transform. We'll have this occur in 0.5 seconds, and we're going to use ease in out. So this is going to control how the arms are going to transition. And again, we aren't going to see anything now because we haven't moved the arms. So all we see is our clock set up, and now it looks like a proper clock. All right, now we're all set with our HTML and our CSS. So up next, we will learn how we can add the JavaScript to actually make this more of an interactive item.